everybody. Thank you very, very much for being here. Happy summer, everybody. So if you have listened to Solda's story, you have heard our speaker, James Kim. He appears in episode 2 to tell us a little bit about the history of reading research. And of course, he knows a lot more about the history of reading research and battles over how to teach reading than what you heard in Solda's story. So I first learned about Jimmy Kim back in 2017. I was trying to understand what the reading wars were all about, and I found this brilliant book chapter. It was in a 2008 book called When Research Matters: How Scholarship Influences Education Policy. And one of the chapters is called Research and the Reading Wars, and it's by James S. Kim. And the chapter takes us way back to the mid-19th century and traces the reading wars over time. And it's really good, and you can actually find a free PDF of this book chapter online, and I highly recommend it. It's called Research and the Reading Wars by James S. Kim. So I assumed that James Kim was an education historian. But then, as I started digging into current reading research, I kept coming across his name. And I realized that he's a prominent reading researcher doing important current real-world work. And specifically, he is doing work that is focused on reading comprehension, which is what he is here to talk with us about today. So let me just tell you a little bit more about him before I invite him to the stage. So Jimmy Kim's research focuses on the development of evidence-based programs designed to build student knowledge and vocabulary. He is a professor of education at Harvard. He used to be a middle school teacher. He develops long-term partnerships with school districts in order to do his research and also to help schools implement evidence-based practices. He oversees something called the READS Lab. READS, in this case, stands for Research Enhances Adaptations Designed for Scale in Literacy. Did I get that right? Yes. Okay. It's a mouthful. Just say READS Lab. And in his bio, he says that, quote, his vision is to inspire all learners to love the written word and to find beauty, goodness, and truth in the natural and social world. I love that. So please welcome Jimmy Kim.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you. So I have some slides to share with you. And I wanted to say thank you, Emily, so much for that nice introduction. I was telling Emily earlier, I'm a professor at Harvard, but I most strongly self-identify as a classroom teacher. This is my hometown. I started my career in education in Northern Virginia. So I am going to tell you a lot about research, but I hope that the lens through which I tell you my story is through that of a classroom teacher. It's interesting that Emily asked me yesterday over email about my name, James or Jimmy, because I'm going to start with the story. Let me start by saying that as I talk about teachers, I love Mr. Rogers. Like, who doesn't love Mr. Rogers? And this is my favorite quote by Mr. Rogers: "Deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex." So what I'm going to do today is I want to tell you about a deep and simple challenge we face, and then a potential simple solution, a test to that solution, and a deep and simple future. Okay, so let me start with the challenge. Okay, this is me in kindergarten in 1975, 1976. That kid right there with, it looks like a deer in headlights. That's me in the middle. And I just want to tell you, I got off to a very rough start in American schools because my Korean name was Sangil, and the American kids could not pronounce my name. And they would say things like, "Your name is Sang," like sang a song, and turning my noun name into a verb, and I just hated it. So I was walking around with my dad one day, and he was taking me to Burger King. And as I was walking around, I saw this poster that said, "My name is Jimmy Carter, I'm running for president." And I said to my dad, Dad, what's a president? And he goes, "He's the most powerful person in the United States, maybe the world. And I looked at him and I said, then I'd like to be called Jimmy too. So I want to tell you, I hated my name until I learned the word president. And president is a very interesting word. The English orthography has a lot of suitcase words like president. So let me tell you what a suitcase word is. A suitcase word, this is a term that was coined by Marvin Minsky. He's an MIT computer scientist and AI pioneer. And what he said is that suitcase words are words that have a jumble of meaning, so much so that they're about to burst open the zipper on your suitcase. And so if you think about the word president, the understanding of the word president depends on the context in which it's used. So when you hear Jimmy Carter is running for president, you should be thinking about the leader of a country. But when you hear that Paige Alexander is a president of the Carter Center, you should be thinking about the CEO of a nonprofit. And when you hear that Alan Garber is president of Harvard University, which you're hearing a lot about these days in the news, you're thinking about the leader of a higher education institute, because that's where I work. Let me give you another simple sentence to underscore what I mean by you know words by context. Let me read this to you. Large and small. Does everyone know what large and small means? A very large mouse is smaller than even a very small elephant. So you know words by the company they keep. And so I'm going to tell you a story about 3 presidents, because I love presidents and I love the word president. And I want to tell you about a president who tried to win the war on poverty. And I have to tell you, every time I get to read this quote, I get goosebumps. So I'm going to read it for you. And I'm going to do a lot of interactive reading today, because I'm a teacher. Okay, are you ready, class? So here you go. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast, hungry. It never occurred to me in my fondest dreams that I might have the chance to help the sons and daughters of those students, and to help people like them all over this country. But now I do have that chance, and I'll let you in on a secret. I mean to use it. I do not want to be the president who built empires or sought grandeur or extended dominion. I want to be the president who educated young children. And do you know who said that? This is, of course, LBJ. And the thing that's interesting about LBJ is that he's the only graduate of an ed school. And he started his career as a teacher. And when he signed the historic 1965 Voting Rights Act into law, he was thinking about the immigrant children he taught in the border town of Cotulla, Texas. When LBJ was president, he launched the war on poverty, and he said that one of the first things that we need to do is we need to give low-income kids in preschool a head start. And I know you've heard of Head Start. Well, it turns out that there are a lot of studies on Head Start early in the history of the program. And Sergeant Shriver, who was LBJ's chief of the Office of Educational Opportunity, looked at the research and he noticed something. And the thing that he noticed is that at the end of first grade, the kids who got Head Start did no better than the kids who didn't. And he had this famous quote, and he said, the benefits of Head Start were crushed by the broken promises of first grade. And do you know what LBJ said to that? Think, LBJ, teacher. What does he think the solution to this problem is going to be? Curriculum. LBJ said something that would make ed schools proud. He said, we need to strengthen Head Start. We've got to begin it for 3-year-olds, but we need to maintain its educational momentum by following through in the early years of school. Emily was talking about how she's digging into the archives about follow-through. Great minds think alike, Emily. Okay, so let me tell you about follow-through. Follow-through was the largest education experiment in American history at that time. $950 million. And the basic idea is we're going to take a bunch of different literacy curricula, and we're going to see which one wins the horse race. And there was one that was like Secretariat. Those of you who don't know who Secretariat was, great horse that won the Triple Crown, and it blew the field away. And that program was called DISTAR, which stands for Direct Instruction for Students at Risk. And DISTAR is very teacher-directed. There's a lot of explicit instruction, important emphasis on foundational reading and math skills, regular assessment of kids so that we make sure that no kids are falling through the cracks. And the thing that's important about DISTAR is we measured kids' literacy skills before the program and after the program. And I want to show you where the kids were at the very beginning when they were in preschool. When they were in preschool, they were scoring at the 18th percentile in a literacy assessment. So the 18th percentile is well below the national average. Like, you're not doing so great. We assess those kids at the end of 3rd grade on a word reading task. And you know what the kids did. They knocked it off the charts. They're at the 83rd percentile. I want everyone to look at that number, 83. Is that amazing? The kids were doing well above the national average. But then we gave another assessment, and it was called the Measure of Academic Achievement, or the Metropolitan. And the kids were only at the 40th percentile. What's going on here? Well, you need to lift the hood of the test. Because what's going on is that the MAT achievement test in reading has a lot of suitcase words. And that's because it's comprised of vocabulary reading. And when you lift the hood, you'll notice that there are lots of words that are beyond the experience of the typical third grader. Definitely the typical third grader from a disadvantaged home. They saw words like country, probably, exterminator, penicillin, disease-causing germs, Egyptians of old. So I want you to think that you're a third grader, you're in DISTAR, and you're asked to read a sentence like this. Penicillin can be used to treat many infections. For example, it can treat respiratory infections such as strep throat. How about social studies? The Egyptians of old are known for their rich culture and impressive architecture. And what Wes Becker, who was one of the developers of DISTAR, said in a classic paper in Harvard Ed Review in 1977, is we are not going to solve the reading comprehension crisis unless kids know these vocabulary words that they see all the time in school. And so I want to tell you about another president who's from Texas, whom you know well, who wanted to leave No Child Left Behind. And I want to share an excerpt with you that also gets me goosebumps. And he said, I care a lot about whether or not our children can learn to read, write, and add and subtract. When I was governor of Texas, I didn't like it one bit when I go to schools in my state and realize children were not learning so they could realize their God-given potential. I didn't like it because I knew the future of our society depended on a good, sound education. And one of the things that President Bush was doing was he was remembering one of the most famous lines from the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which said that a good education is the foundation of strong citizenship. And what President Bush and Congress did is they enacted No Child Left Behind. If you've listened to Emily's podcast, Sold a Story, there's a whole episode on reading first. And the thing about reading first is it was about a $1 billion investment to improve scientifically based reading instruction. What is it about the United States where we spend like $1 billion on big literacy curriculum interventions? It shows how much we care about this, right? We all know how important this is. So you all know what the 5 pillars are, right? The 5 pillars, the big 5. You see this everywhere, right? Phonological awareness, phonics knowledge, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. I'm not going to tell you about the results on student outcomes. What I want to tell you about is a finding that doesn't get as much press, that people don't know about. It turns out that when we did Reading First, you had some schools that got Reading First funding, some schools that didn't. We actually had researchers go inside the schools, and I know a lot of you are teachers, and count the number of minutes teachers are spending on the Big 5. Now you figure if it's called the Big 5, we should be spending a lot of time on each of the Big 5. And that is not what we found. Let me tell you what we found. What we found is that these are effect sizes. It's just putting things in apples to apples comparison. So like when you see plus 0.23, it means that Reading First classrooms, they do more of phonological awareness. But basically what we found is that there was an increase in the Big 3, right? There was a lot more phonological awareness, a lot more phonics, a lot more fluency. Those are all statistically significant, which means that we're pretty confident that this is a meaningful finding. And in comprehension and vocabulary, not statistically significant, really no difference. And if you're wondering, like, what did this translate into? It's about 1 to 3 extra minutes per day on the Big 3, okay? So what would you expect to happen with students given what you see happening in classrooms? Well, you would expect that they might improve their decoding, but not their comprehension, right? And that is exactly what we found. History repeated itself because, like DISTAR, Reading First improved decoding, but not reading comprehension. I hope I'm making you deeply cynical right now. I'm a good news guy. I'm not, of course, I'm going to leave you with hope, right? But right now, I want you to feel like, oh my gosh, this is not looking good. I'm going to get you even more cynical because this is the last president I want to talk about. Well, actually, before I talk about this president, I want to lift the hood. Okay, so I'm all about lifting the hood of the reading test. Like one of the big things I want you to do is always ask, like, what are we asking kids to do, right? what are we asking kids to do on the Stanford 10 reading comprehension test? There's one thing I want to highlight. The narrative of informational selections reflect the kinds of fiction and nonfiction students read in school. They have been written for Stanford 10. Pause here, everyone. Do you see this phrase, fiction, nonfiction, students read in school, I want to highlight that idea for a moment. Because it turns out that when you look at school texts, there is an explosion of suitcase words very early in kids' careers. So let me give you an example. This is a study done in 2022 in Journal of Ed Psych by Jill Fitzgerald and her colleague. She's a close colleague of mine. And I want you to look at kind of the words that are showing up in the most popular textbooks. So let's take a look over here at science. You see like glacier and mathematics, measurement, and social studies republic. General academic words that show across content areas. Activity example. Does that surprise you that in first grade, kids are seeing those words for the first time? We are exposing kids to tons of suitcase words in the first 4 years of their schooling career. And in fact, if you plot these words, like when they first appear across grades, what you will see is that there's massive exponential growth. It's not linear, it's exponential, right when kids are starting their schooling careers. And this has huge implications for what schools have to do, given what textbooks expect kids to be able to handle in terms of these important words. Okay, so I've got to tell you, of course, about the third and final president. He wanted every student to succeed because he wanted every student to be ready for college. And when he signed the Every Student Succeeds Act into law, this is what he said. He said, first, this law focuses on a national goal of ensuring that all of our students graduate prepared for college and future careers. This bill upholds a core value that animated the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act signed by President Lyndon Johnson. The value that says education, the key to economic opportunity, is a civil right. Every time I read those excerpts by President Johnson, President Bush, President Obama, you know what I'm going to say? I get goosebumps. Don't you feel inspired? I feel so inspired by these quotes. And the thing about President Obama is that he led one of the, under his Department of Education, he made a huge research and development investment to improve reading comprehension. He wanted all kids to read for understanding from preschool to kindergarten, and that initiative was called Reading for Understanding. It was a $125 million initiative, and it kind of wrapped up about the time he signed the ESSA law into a policy. And when President Obama gave this speech and RFE was wrapping up, I was reflecting on this really historic R&D effort because I was a part of it. So I was an insider, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we learned. Well, what we learned is the following. We learned that teaching reading comprehension is a lot harder than rocket science, a lot harder than rocket science. So I know you've seen this article by Louisa Moats. It's a wonderful article where she kind of says the same thing about reading in general. And what's important about Reading for Understanding is that it was modeled after the Apollo 11 mission. So the idea is if America could send astronauts to the moon and return them safely to space, couldn't we help all kids read for understanding? And so what we did is just like what NASA did in the 1960s, we said, we're going to convene 6 teams, the best and brightest scholars and teachers and policymakers, and we're going to have them develop novel curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And they're going to be able to help all kids read for understanding. And the news from Reading for Understanding, in my opinion, is kind of mixed. And the reason it's mixed is because there was a report that came out called Reaping the Rewards of the Reading for Understanding Initiative in 2020. And it reviewed the entire $125 million investment. And it was kind of going through all the results, trying to figure out, like, what did we learn? And in this 500-plus page report that I know you're probably not going to be excited about digging through, I'm going to just highlight for you my favorite sentence, okay? So here we go. Here's my favorite sentence from this massive report. Transfer, being able to apply new skills and ideas and settings and on measures that differ from the instructional context is, and always has been, a worthy goal, perhaps a gold standard of curriculum and instruction enterprises. But it is, and likely always will be, a challenge to achieve. And what the RFU report was saying is that we could do incredible things with kids under the tutelage and guidance of a teacher. And if you taught them about the human body system, they would learn a lot about the human body system. But then, when you gave them an assessment on a topic that they weren't taught, there wasn't any difference between the kids who got that novel curriculum and the kids who didn't. And the person who I think summed this up the best is my friend and colleague Hugh Katz. Hugh's a great language literacy researcher at Florida State. And he wrote an article in the American Educator, and he was talking about 2015 when he was sitting at a meeting in DC with a lot of RFU researchers. And this is what he said. He said, unfortunately, the preliminary results that the panel presented fell short of these expectations. The reported studies found that students receiving a variety of comprehension interventions made gains compared with control groups on assessments closely tied to the interventions. But they showed limited or no significant gains on standardized measures like the MAT, the Stanford Achievement Test that I showed you earlier, of reading comprehension. Needless to say, conference attendees were surprised and discouraged by these results. Okay, I studied US history as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, and you know one of the first things you learn as a history major? History repeats itself, right? History is repeating itself. And so 2015 was a very important year of my professional career. I have been part of Reading for Understanding. As Emily said, I had thought about the research in the reading wars. I thought about LBJ, George Bush, Barack Obama, these amazing leaders who try to do something to improve reading comprehension. And I realized that our society was at a crossroads. And we needed to figure out, like, what is it that we were going to do next to try to move the needle on reading comprehension. And one of the things that our society invested in is third grade reading initiatives. We started thinking, like, third grade's a really sticky measure. You know, third grade reading tests, if you do well in third grade, it's going to predict how well you're going to do in high school and whether you're going to go to college. If you're college career ready, it's going to really help you later in life. So cities started focusing on third grade reading. And one of those cities was Charlotte. And Charlotte was really worried about inequality. It had the lowest rate of intergenerational mobility. And the civic leaders, the business leaders, and the education community rallied around this third grade idea. And it said, you know, we're going to start this thing called Read Charlotte. And we're going to try to double the percentage of kids who are college and career ready from 40 to 80%, 2015 to 2025. What year is it right now? 2025, okay. And we're going to try to do this at scale for everyone. And I'm an idealistic guy, but I'm a realistic idealist. And I thought to myself, you know, this is going to be really hard. And one of the first things that I wanted to do is I just wanted to understand the nature of the problem. Like, what is it that we're going to have to do to try to achieve this goal? And so I want to tell you the tale of two readers. I want to tell you a story about two readers. One of those readers, his name is Josh. And Josh is college career ready by third grade. And Jimmy is not. And I will show you this figure here. I feel like I'm teaching you from my Harvard class and telling you about psychometrics, but very simple. Okay, class, does everyone see this right here? All right, this thing over here, this vertical axis says reading score, MAP RIT. So MAP is a computer adaptive reading math test that's given in over 9,000 US school districts. And the way you can think about it, it's kind of like a ladder, where equal differences on this ladder imply equal differences on the trait that's being measured. So here it's reading comprehension. And do you see over here, you see like KBOY, that's kindergarten beginning of the year, and then kindergarten middle of the year, and kindergarten EOY. I know, if you're a teacher, you understand this code. It's like secret code, BOY, MOY, EOY. And what I want to highlight is that Jimmy, who's not college career ready by third grade, he's scoring a 177 at the beginning of third grade. And Josh is at a 200. And the thing about Josh is he was scoring a 179 way back in the middle of first grade. All right, so Jimmy's really behind. Now let me ask you a question. what can a deep reader like Josh actually comprehend? What does that 200 score mean in terms of his comprehension skills? I'll show you. What Josh can read is he can read a passage about how platinum is a silver white metal that is even more valuable than gold. And you know Jimmy, how about that simple reader? How about Jimmy? What can he read? Well, he can read a passage about how a hen lays about 1 egg a day. And what I want to ask you is what makes that MAP 201-204-210 passage so hard? Why is that so difficult? I want to take a deep look, and I want to show you in 4 simple colors, okay? So I hope no one's colorblind, okay? All right, here we go. All right, so the first thing that I want to highlight is that, do you notice that there's this blue word called pollutants? And this is academic vocabulary that's domain specific. You're going to see pollutants a lot in life science. It's a suitcase word, because how many different types of pollutants can you think of? Yeah, you know the Harvard Medical School dean, he called misinformation a pollutant, okay? All right, so how about these red words like processes? That's academic vocabulary that's domain general. You're going to see processes across school subjects. Another suitcase words, right? It's got a jumble of meanings, about to burst open your suitcase. How about nominalizations like catalyst, densely packed nouns? These are words where we turn the verbs into nouns. And these are also suitcase words, because catalyst is going to mean something very different in science versus history. And then you see these multi-syllable words where you have to know these common morphemes, like ed means past tense. So you need to know the phonemes and the morphemes, what the words sound like, what the words mean, the smallest units of sound and meaning. And if you're like Josh, you know what you can do? You can read, you're a deep reader, because you can read text with fluency, you can navigate complex syntax, hold the sentences in working memory, and connect this vocabulary to prior knowledge in science, history, and other topics. And what about Jimmy? What makes that 171 passage easy? I'm going to make the argument it doesn't have a lot of suitcase words, because all it is a hen lays about 1 egg a day. A chick takes 3 weeks to be born from an egg. Does everyone see hen? That's just a single syllable consonant, vowel, consonant word. It's what we call level 2 decodability demand, because most kids master this very early in their schooling careers. How about this red word chick, right? This is a digraph gland. The CH makes the ch sound. And how about this word takes? Single syllable consonant, vowel, consonant, the silent E. And what about weeks? Right, vowel teams, EE, weeks. And how about born? That's an R-controlled vowel. And lays, that's a level 7 diphthong. If you're Jimmy and you're a simple reader, you can decode all of these single syllable words. You can read simple texts that are familiar. You can read, and all of these words are within your realm of experience. And this skill, of course, is important. This is absolutely essential. I do not want to diminish the importance of this ability, but it is not sufficient. And what I want to do is I want to go back here, and I want to point out something to you, my friends, which is a deep reader is nearly 1.5 years ahead of a simple reader in the first few years of their education careers. I want you to think about how massive that disparity is. And now I'm going to ask you another question. Do you think Josh is from a high socioeconomic status family and Jimmy is from a low socioeconomic status family? Josh and Jimmy, which may surprise you, are both from low socioeconomic status families. And the reason why I'm emphasizing the individual differences is because many of you, like me, when we taught, we had to deal with Josh and Jimmy. We have to deal with these massive individual differences in the classroom. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about that? And what we have to do is we have to think about deep and simple solutions, not shallow and complex solutions, but we have to think about the Mr. Rogers solutions. What would Mr. Rogers do? Okay. All right, so let me tell you about one idea. This is a program called, by the American Reading Company called Zoology 1. Maybe you've heard of it. And the reason I'm highlighting it is because there was a big randomized controlled trial of this program in Philadelphia. And Zoology 1, in my opinion, teaches kindergartners suitcase words in greater depth, and it integrates literacy with science content. All right? Schools don't have a lot of time, so they usually cut science and social studies, so why not just integrate literacy and science? And the thing about Zoology 1 is you see these books that kids are going to be read aloud. Okay, you see this book over here, Frogs and Toads. I hope you like Frogs and Toads. Okay, let me open up the glossary to you. You know what I'm going to show you? You know what the answer is. I'm going to show you a bunch of suitcase words. Ability, field guide, habitat, predators, prey, rodents. With the possible exception of rodents, every single one of those words has a jumble of meaning, and their meaning depends on the context in which they're used. That's what the kids are being exposed to. And of course, when we think of science or reading, if I said to you, hey, what's the picture that you think of when you think of science or reading? You're all going to say, the reading rope. Yeah, I see a lot of you nodding. This is a very famous paper published by Hollis Scarborough, who's a phenomenal scholar. She was part of the National Academy of Sciences Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children community. And she came up with this brilliant picture of how you get skilled reading. Kids have to recognize the words, they have to understand spoken language, and that's how you get reading. Very simple, deep and simple. Okay. The brilliance of ARC 1 is what it does is it integrates the two. And this is taken from the study itself, the paper that was published. It says, the program includes code-focused instruction emphasizing alphabet knowledge, phonics, and phonological awareness. Okay? Where is that? Bingo, right here, under the blue. Everyone see that? All right, and what does it do with the language? What it does with the language, just go to the last sentence here. It's going to build background knowledge, vocabulary, language vectors, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge in just 3 units. A unit on zoology, ecology, entomology over the entire school year. 3 units, everyone. Do you know what entomology is? I actually didn't know what that is, study of insects. Yeah, okay? So that's it. And we're going to integrate these two. Well, what did the study show? Do the kids get ARC 1? Do they do better than the kids who get the typical program, which is a lot of breath? The answer is they do a lot better. The kids who get ARC 1, they do better in passage comprehension at the end of kindergarten. They do better on letter naming, and their motivation is better. See, people think, well, maybe it's demotivating if you really... No, the motivation is better. You know why? Because when you know something about a topic and you get to read more about it, your motivation gets better. But if you're cold reading everything, less so, okay? All right, so here's my message, I think, from this study. Do not underestimate kids. You remember those words I was showing you that show up in for a second? That's no joke, everyone. I know, I wish I was more eloquent than that's no joke. But seriously, those are hard, hard words, okay? So I'm inspired by this, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, what can I do for American education? How can I contribute to society's effort to solve the reading comprehension crisis? Well, Emily, I went back and I read history. And I read about this guy, Jerome Bruner, who's a giant in the field of cognitive psychology. He was a professor at Harvard for many years. And he wrote this very important book in 1960 called The Process of Education. And what Bruner said was something that really inspired me. He said that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. He was completely against the idea that we have to make things developmentally appropriate. He said that's hogwash. You can teach economics to first graders. We actually are doing that. The difference between teaching a first grade economics versus a PhD at Harvard is not a difference of a kind, but of degree. It's just that you have to start with the more foundational ideas. So Bruner said, what we need to do is we have to think about spiral curriculum, where the first thing we would want to do is we would want to focus on schemas. And schemas are like the big ideas in disciplines. So if you think about economics, what's a big idea? How about economic decision-making or market systems, supply and demand? And we have to gradually introduce complexity. We have to start with simple topics and then go to more complex topics. And then we have to think about academic vocabulary networks. That's just like all those suitcase words. And the thing is, like, if you give kids suitcase words, they can travel space and time and culture. And that's what transfer is. When I read about this, I got really excited, and I danced around. Okay. And I thought about, what if we taught a spiral curriculum about how living systems function properly and included lots of suitcase words? And so instead of like bombarding kids with living systems in first grade, how about if we taught them about how animals survive in like ecosystems, and then how scientists study mass extinctions, how scientists study living systems. So we developed this program called Model Read Engagement. It has a lot of overlap with ARC and other programs that do similar things. And we started with this idea that like we could teach novices about these schemas. And one of the very general schemas that kids are going to encounter in their schooling careers is how do scientists study past events? Would you agree? I want you to think about all the different scientists who study past events that are not directly observable. Lots of scientists. But if I told a first grader, we're going to study about scientists, and how they say, they're going to check out. That's not that interesting. So what we do is, in first grade, we're going to teach kids about, how do animals survive in their habitat? Because a schema, which is like a mental model that helps you connect, helps you acquire and connect and apply knowledge so that knowledge has a home and you don't forget it. We know that animals want to survive in their habitat. They need food, water, air, protection from external events. If they lack these resources, they're not going to have advantages over predators. So what they have to do is they have to adapt their physical characteristics and behaviors, and that's how they don't become extinct. Did you hear a lot of those suitcase words in that little schema that I shared with you? Well, that's what we're going to do in first grade. And then in second grade, we are going to study how paleontologists study prehistoric events in animals like dinosaur mass extinctions. And we know that paleontologists, they have to use evidence to study prehistoric events. They have to collect multiple pieces of evidence. They can't directly observe dinosaurs, their physical characteristics, behaviors, and habitats because they don't live anymore. And so they're going to use multiple sources of evidence to theorize about what dinosaurs look like, how they behave, and then they can support claims. Now, do I care that kids learn about animals, like Arctic animals in their habitat, and paleontologists, studying dinosaur mass extinctions? I kind of care about that, but what I really care about is if kids get this general schema, because that's what's going to help them transfer to a lot of other different scenarios. So here's a first grade teacher's concept map. Isn't that beautiful? It's a beautiful work. So we have teachers put up a concept map. And what we do is we ask teachers to have a child-friendly definition. So if everyone looks over here at this word interdependent, it's when two or more animals need each other to survive. Okay? Very hard word, but we're going to give the children a child-friendly definition. We're going to show links between the words because you know these words by the company they keep. When you see interdependent, you'll see those other words in life science. And we're going to have labeled images, but the most important thing that I want to communicate to you is this idea of knowing words. What does it mean to know a word? And what does it mean to know a word deeply? If you know a word, you know its phonology, its orthography, and its morphology. In just plain English, you know how to pronounce it, how to spell it, its meaning, and most importantly, you know a word by the company it keeps. And so what the teachers will say is, I want you to trace the letters to spell the concept word. Then I want you to copy the definition in your notebook. And then I want you to think of other examples or characters associated with the context. So when you think of behavior, you can write down dig a den or wait quietly. That's what polar bears do. So that's what we want kids to do, to know these words deeply. And when they're at home, we want the kids to read these books that are connected to the schemas that they learned in first grade and the schemas that they learned in second grade. I wish I had this book. These are really cool books. I wish I had Who Would Win, Polar Bear versus Grizzly Bear. The only reason I wish that is because, the innocuous word bear, B-E-A-R, it seems like so simple. That's not a suitcase word. It is a suitcase word. What did JFK say at his inauguration? The United States will bear any burden to assure the success and survival of liberty. Bear is a very important suitcase. It has lots of different meanings. Okay, so I know, random footnote. Let's keep going. Grade 2. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to read aloud who would win, Tyrannosaurus versus Velociraptor. And the kids, again, will see that these words, dinosaur, paleontologist, are related. They're going to see on page 7 that paleontologists found fossilized bones because we want them to get the idea that they're collecting evidence to develop these theories. They're going to get a definition of paleontologist, scientist who studies animals and plants that lived long ago. And we want to build kids' metalinguistic skills, their ability to manipulate the structural features of language, the sounds in words, the morphemes in words, and how words are built, especially these words with lots of Greek morphemes, which is very common in science. And then we're going to do the same thing, because basically all we're going to do is we are going to embed suitcase words and discussions, read alouds, reading, writing. We're going to zoom in. What is that? We're going to use suitcase. Well, let's do a read aloud. Now let's look at concept map. Let's continue to read aloud. Now we want you to do some writing. Now we want you to think about some vocabulary words and do some independent reading. And when you do all these things, we are going to embed tons of suitcase words so you know these words deeply. And now I want you to think to yourself, like, Jimmy, did any of this work? Does any of this work? Are you going to just repeat history? Okay? So let me tell you what we did. So we did a study that is a fair test of this idea. It was a 3-year randomized controlled trial of a spiral curriculum. And what we did is we took 30 schools and we flipped a coin, and they were assigned either to the spiral curriculum, the treatment, or the control group. Now, why is that coin flip so important? It's important because you get a fair test. It means that if there's any difference at the end, it's not because the kids were more motivated or because the teachers really wanted to be in the program. Everybody's the same on things you can see, not see about the kids and the teachers. And so we're going to do how do animals survive in their habitats in grade 1, how do paleontologists study dinosaur mass extinctions, and how do scientists think about living systems like the human body. And I'm going to have these QR codes in case you want to look at some of these papers. And what we did is basically, if you look at a grade 2 teacher, you can see the spiral curriculum in action. You see the grade 1 concepts, dinosaurs survive, they have physical characteristics. Now we're not talking about polar bears or living animals, we're talking about dinosaurs. And notice that the grade 2 concepts build on grade 1 because dinosaurs are studied by paleontologists who find and study fossils, and they use that fossil evidence to support theory. Everyone see that? What are we doing here? We are revisiting topics and concepts in greater depth and complexity over time. Now, does everyone see the word dinosaur? If I told you that at the end of grade 2, we asked the kids in the treatment and the control groups to read about dinosaurs, and the spiral curriculum, the spiral treatment group kids do better than the control, do you know what you're going to say to me? You're going to say, that's no fair, Jimmy. You know, it's like the only kids who got exposed to the topic were the treatment group kids. That's a Hugh Katz problem, right? We're not going to ask kids to read about dinosaurs. You know what we're going to ask them to read about? We're going to ask them to read about Ammonites. Ammonites are not friends of the Hittites and Jebusites who terrorized the Jewish people in the Old Testament. Ammonites are fish fossils that became extinct during the 5th mass extinction, when dinosaurs became extinct. And when we ask the teachers to reflect on their instruction, this is what a typical teacher told us in the spiral curriculum. This teacher said in this interview, well, evidence goes hand in hand with fossil because a fossil is evidence that the dinosaurs were here. So I wanted to say, when I introduced this word fossil, the word evidence kind of came in, and then it also comes in, the word evidence kind of came in, and then it also comes in with theory because you have to have evidence of these different theories. If I didn't tell you that was a 2nd grade teacher, you probably wouldn't have predicted that. So you probably predicted, wow, that's pretty sophisticated, right? In fact, this is the way I talk to my grad students. I'm always talking about theory. Okay, this is what's happening in the control group. Teacher says, the district curriculum was more like a word wall. Vocabulary was introduced almost as a slide with a definition. And you would use that word all the time. It was more like a word wall than concept mapping, tying it all together, which is how I perceive concept mapping, to connect those dots. So the treatment group teachers are building this kind of web in kids' minds, a network, and the control group teacher is trying to build a dictionary in kids' heads. And so we have to ask this question, like, how do we translate this theory into measures? Like, how would we know if kids can actually build those networks? So there's this famous paper in 1975 called A Spreading Activation Theory of Semantic Processing. Do you know why I chose this paper? Because it's 1975, the year I came to America and started kindergarten. Okay, there are these classic papers that you just come back to. And one of the things that's important about this paper is it has nothing to do with literacy. It has all to do with how our minds create knowledge networks. And one thing that this paper says is that in a network model of memory, words label concepts. And those concepts are called nodes in network theory. And the connection between nodes are relationships or edges. So what I want you to think about is for every one of those concept words, there are these relationships, okay? Number 2 is the idea of spreading activation. When kids read a word, the concept is activated as well as related concept, even those that are not directly taught by teachers, right? So if I say the word survival, you've got all these other words in your mind that are activated with survival. You know, how do animals survive? You're thinking about survival, all these other things. Even those things that teachers didn't directly teach. And the third idea is semantic distance, that closely related concepts are more likely to be activated. As a teacher was telling you, when you see theory, you're going to probably see evidence. When you see theory, you're not going to see bacon. Okay? They're just totally unrelated. Okay, that's the basic idea. Okay, did everyone get those 3 points? I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures now. All right, so how would you turn this into a measure? So what we did is we used natural language processing tools. As you can think of it as like a class of AI tools. And we said, we're going to go into these textbooks that are used in America's classrooms, and we're going to ask this tool to identify a focal word like paleontologist. Does everyone see that little diamond? Go into these textbooks and find paleontologist. And when you see paleontologist, what are the other words that show up with it? And what you will see here, not surprisingly, is that when you see paleontologist, you're going to see fossil, extinct, dinosaur, right? You see all these words. And we're going to call these taught words because these are the words that teachers are going to put on their concept map. And they're going to talk about the spelling, the pronunciation, the meaning. They're directly taught. But then there are these untaught words. These are words like carnivore, organism, reptile. They also show up when paleontologist shows up. But we can't have teachers try to build a dictionary in kids' heads. What we need teachers to do is build that network, that web of words that becomes very sticky, so that when the kids hear reptile, organism, and carnivore in like a read aloud, it'll stick. Because that's what needs to happen. They need to build this network that is so sticky that when they hear these words incidentally in a read aloud, they're able to learn those words. Okay, so assume you're a second grader, you're in my study, and here's what we're going to ask you to do. We're not going to ask you to define words. We're going to say to you, circle 2 words that go with evidence. Choosing, proving, showing, feeling. Circle 2 words that go with theory. Theory, theme, argument, idea. Pretty sophisticated, huh? What are we trying to get? What are we trying to figure out? Can the kids, do they know the words by the company they keep? And then remember I told you that we're not going to ask kids to read about dinosaurs. We're going to ask them to read about ammonites. So in the near transfer passage, they read a passage that says, there have been 5 mass extinctions in the Earth's history. What happened during the 5th mass extinction nearly 66 million years ago? What species was gone forever? Dinosaurs? What about fish in the ocean? Now, why do I call this near transfer? I call this near transfer because in this passage are all the words they were taught. So you remember those like taught words? They're there in the passage. And do you notice that the passage scenario is very similar to the instructional scenario? Okay, what do we ask them to read in the mid-transfer? Archaeologists in the city of Pompeii, nearly 2,000 years ago, a volcano eruption destroyed an old city. It was called Pompeii. The eruption of a mountain was brutal. It lasted for more than 24 hours. By the end, Pompeii was covered in ashes. Many people died. This city was totally destroyed. It was like a mass extinction. Why is this mid-transfer? Because now we're not going to include as many of those words, and the passage scenario is really different from the instructional scenario. Okay, what do you think we ask the kids to read about in far transfer? We want that to feel very different from what they learned in class. You know what we're going to ask them to read? Genealogists and our descendants. Some people want to know about their ancestors. They want to know about their relatives who lived a long time ago. Often there are no living family members who know about those relatives. So sometimes they hire a genealogist. In this passage, there's none of those words. And this is so different from what the kids were taught. Well, let me tell you what we learned about vocabulary. I feel like the Wizard of Oz because I'm always putting up blue walls and green walls. Okay, so because I want to scaffold this. Okay, so in the control group, I just want to focus on one thing. Do you notice in the control group, the word hypothesis and brutal, there's no green line attaching them? What that means is that kids are not learning those 2 words together. Like knowing one doesn't predict knowing the other. Okay, look over here at treatment. Do you notice that brutal, there is a green line? What those lines represent is kids' ability to know these words together, right? It's their ability to know these words by the company they keep versus just learning words kind of in isolation. It tells us about the structure of their vocabulary network in their minds. And so if I move this, what you can see here when we model this is that, do you notice that over here in the treatment group, when we look at the treatment group kids, there's these thick green lines among all of these words, is because the strength of their vocabulary network is much greater in the treatment group than the control group. Now, why does that matter? Like you're thinking, like, why does that, who cares, Jimmy? That's a nice little visual. Who cares? Well, the reason you should care is because if you know these words, especially the suitcase words, you can transfer them. Right? Because semantically related words often appear together. Paleontologists study dinosaur fossils to learn how they survive in their habitat and to develop a theory about their extinction. I want you to go over here. You see the word dinosaurs? Switch that out for ammonites, right? If you can know words deeply, you can read widely across a lot of different passages. And what we found is that the kids do better on the near transfer in the spiral. They do better on the mid transfer, but they don't do better on the far transfer. And how did I feel about that? I said, well, we're not done with the study. All right, we got one more year. Maybe it just takes another year. And do you remember that ARC Zoology 1 curriculum I showed you earlier? I want you to imagine that the kids are listening to their teacher read this aloud. Zoologists study wild animals like elephants to learn how they survive in their man-made habitat. You see, if you know these words together by the company they keep, you can understand a lot of different passages in a variety of contexts. And so what happened in grade 3? Do you remember the study that we're doing? Oh yeah, something happened in the spring of 2020. Yeah, it's, I'm a pretty resilient guy. I wasn't that bummed out. And I said, well, we have a really important choice here. And one of my core values is service. I believe in serving school districts in science. So what we did is we actually gave the 3rd grade human body curriculum to everyone. We needed to serve all kids in an educational emergency. But we needed to keep the science going and to learn. Now, what I want you all to pay attention to is that if we're going to give the treatment to everyone, what we're testing is the full spiral against a partial spiral. And so what we're really testing is how important are those 1st and 2nd grade years? Is it really, does knowledge building, does that spiral really matter? Okay, let me tell you. So in 3rd grade, just like we always do in more, we start with an engaging end, and we tell the kids, and we did this in a hybrid, so there are synchronous Zoom lessons and asynchronous reading activities. And we say, students, your job is to help astronauts like Dr. Mae Jemison keep their bodies healthy in space. We're going to learn about what systems are. Systems have this system schema has a lot of suitcase words. Your muscles can shrink in space. The brain can have problems, and the bones become weak in space. So you know what a system is? That's a pretty hard word, isn't it? A system has parts that move or work together to achieve a goal. Okay? Child-friendly death. And we're going to learn about a system, human body system, which has a structure and a function. Do you like structure and function? Very important words. And we're going to talk about the muscular system, the nervous system, and the skeletal system. Okay, I want to go to the end. What did we ask kids to read? I want to lift the hood. Are we going to ask them to read about the human body system? Definitely not. What are we going to ask them to read? We're going to ask them to read how a human is a primate. In primates, the heart sends oxygen in the blood all around the body. The body must have oxygen to function properly. The strong heart muscle contracts to pump blood all around the body. Healthy heart never rests. Okay, do you like that? Okay, here's a mid-transfer passage. It's a passage about North American migratory birds and why their skeletal system is changing because of climate change. Right? So some birds that are here today are smaller than they were many years ago. Why is this happening? It's a mystery. How do scientists study a mystery? First, scientists try to understand the bird's skeletal and muscular systems. Now, I want you to think about this mid-transfer passage. Do you notice that in the mid-transfer passage, it builds on the grade 1 schema for how do animals survive? Do you also notice how it builds on the 2nd grade schema for how do scientists study past events? They can't observe the skeletal structure of migratory birds changing right before their eyes, but they have these bones that they're looking at. And do you notice how they have to have an understanding of the grade 3 schema? How living systems function properly? So, what are we going to ask them to read in the far transfer? What do you think is going to be a really good passage to ask? To see if they can take something that they learned under the guidance and tutelage of their teachers to a very novel problem. Well, we're going to ask them to read a passage about skyscrapers. Because in many ways, skyscrapers are like the human body. They have bones that keep it tall and strong and skin to protect the body. They have a command center that is like a brain. Now, we don't want to put any of the words in there. And we don't want this scenario to be similar to the instructional scenario. But what are you all thinking as I just read that? You're thinking about the skeletal system of a skyscraper. You're thinking about the nervous system of a skyscraper. I know, personification, all kinds of fun stuff. And the thing is, the anatomy of a skyscraper is like a human body. All the parts have to work together. That's how a city skyscraper works properly, because the really important schema we're actually trying to teach is what a system is. And what I want you to think about is, how do you think the kids did? Do you think that kids in the full spiral treatment do better than the partial spiral control? I have to tell you, when we did this study, Emily, I was thinking to myself, there's no way they're going to do better because like everyone got the program in 3rd grade, right? So all the things I just showed you, like everyone's getting that. I'll tell you the results. Because what I'm thinking about is honoring those great presidents, right? And all the great things that they had done. Well, what we found is that the kids in war, they do better, right? It's 0.1 further, they're moving from like the 50 to the 56th percentile, but they do better on the near, they do better on the monkey hearts passage, better on bird buzz, and better on skyscrapers. So now we're really excited, but do you remember what Hughes said? But does it transfer to those state standardized tests? Well, what happens 14 months later? The kids took all these tests in school because the schools reopened in the pandemic year. Then 14 months later, they took the reading test that you take at the end of the year. And what we find is that the kids in Moore still do better, statistically significant positive, on the reading test. And they do better on the math test. Now you're probably scratching your heads, like why? Why? It's because in many states, reading and math tests are highly correlated. And the reason they're highly correlated is because most of the math tests are word problems. Did you know that in many states, if you run a Lexile analysis, which is just a readability score, that the Lexile of the math test is harder than the reading test? It has a lot more of those suitcase words like measurement, a system of equations. Okay, so we're pretty happy about this. And this is my absolute favorite children's book, Charlotte's Web. I know that you love Charlotte's Web too. And the reason I'm talking about Charlotte's Web is because I get this question a lot. Jimmy, what's a secret sauce? What's going on? Like, what do you think is making this all work? And my answer to your question, to that question is Charlotte's Web. Do you remember Terrific? And Some Pig? Yeah? My answer is Terrific, Radiant, Humble. Those are what I call a web of wise words. Those are words that you know by the company they keep. And the reason why I call these a web of wise words is because they're not just smart words. They're not just words that you know in your head, but they're words that you can apply across all these contexts. And if you know those words, you know the deeper schema that those words are naming. Because the schema that Charlotte is trying to communicate to the farmer who's about to kill a wilbur is noble qualities. Okay, let me wrap it up with a deep and simple future. And I think I'm right at 50 minutes. I'm like, okay, all right, conclusion. Yes, the reading comprehension is worse than you think. Because LBJ, George Bush, Barack Obama, we've learned that it's easier to improve decoding than reading comprehension. And look, if the president is the most powerful person in the country, if not the world, and they struggle to do this, this is a tough challenge. But the other reason why the reading comprehension crisis is worse than you think, I know you see NAEP score, you're in DC, you read the things that Emily read, you see, I know that. But the reason why it's worse than you think is because it is in grades 1 to 4 where there is an explosion of suitcase words. It is like the Cambrian explosion of species, where we just had single cell species to multicellular, very complex species in a very short period of the Earth's geological history. But we have instruction that is not up to that challenge right now. And so what can school do? I think schools can do something about it. And what I think I've shown you is that if schools teach fewer topics in greater depth and kids know science, know suitcase words deeply, kids can travel space, time, and culture, I think we're overdoing standards. You know that scene in Forrest Gump where there's like rain coming from the top sideways up? That's what we do to school teachers. Standard after standard. We've got to teach fewer things better. And reading comprehension fundamentally depends on knowing words by the company you keep. I told you what I mean by knowing words. And if you have great and good teachers like Charlotte A. Kavatica, she can spin a web of wise words that empower learners to find beauty, goodness, and truth in a natural social world. I want to let you know that Reed's Lab is a lab I run. And one thing that I wanted to say, just to build on what Emily said, is way down here, just to read this, we seek to elevate teaching and the teaching profession by generating usable knowledge for school teachers, improving literacy and educational opportunities and outcomes for all students, and building a strong and vibrant democracy. I wanted to highlight that because I love the vision of Planet Word. Planet Word's vision is to increase literacy, the foundation of a strong modern democracy. Great organizations think alike. Okay.
Okay, thank you all so much for being here. Let's give another round of applause to Jimmy Kim. I think you're sitting over there.
Thanks.
I think you're the most on-time speaker we've had.
I timed
I love
myself.
it. I know. He is well prepared. A good professor and clearly a good teacher, which they are not all, and a good student. So thank you so much. You brought up so many things that I just absolutely loved. Mr. Rogers, my mother is in the audience. Mr. Rogers is one of our favorites. What would Mr. Rogers do? Deep and simple. I think you're going to love it when we go to see upstairs, Suitcase Words. You're going to love that when you see the very first display here. And any of you in the audience who haven't had a chance to see the museum yet, please take time to go see it. Yeah, and teach fewer things better. Yeah, isn't that good? Okay, so I'm just going to ask a couple questions, and then we're going to get right to the audience questions. So many things to think about and ask. So when we did our interview for Sold a Story, which was back in 2021, one of the things you said to me is that if you were going to write a book or another book chapter about the reading wars now, you would call it "This Time is Different." Okay, so given so why? Do you still feel that way 4 years later?
I do. So I think one of the things that's so important about reading for understanding is when I talk to teachers, people are very unfamiliar with reading for understanding.
Yes.
And the reason why I would say this time is different is one thing that I try to do in my narrative that I didn't make explicit, but I want to make explicit now, is that there's no such thing as a killer study, right? So politicians depend on professors and practitioners to do peaceful science that's productive. Like, we're not trying to win wars. We're trying to slowly accumulate knowledge. I don't actually look at LBJ's Distar or George Bush's Reading First or Barack Obama. They're not failures. It's a slow accumulation of knowledge that we build on. And so when I was saying, this time is different, is I think we have to get away from the quick fix solution. And we have to think about what do we know from the last 50 years and what can we do to just extend the frontiers of knowledge just a little bit more by having politicians work with professors and practitioners. So yes, I do. And I think what I'm so proud of, Emily, is like I often tell people my job is to share good news and celebrate others. I talk to you a lot about our work, but I talk to you about ARC. I could tell you about a lot of other things. I think there's now a critical mass of studies that are showing the way that we can really move the needle on reading comprehension.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. It's very helpful. One of the thoughts that I was having yesterday as I was preparing for this and rereading that book chapter for probably like the 20th time, is I was thinking, well, maybe the reading wars are over, are like coming to an end. But it doesn't necessarily mean reading outcomes are going to improve.
Yeah.
Because of so many of the things you've talked about, and maybe the state of our world and what's happening with sort of investments in research and progress potentially. So yeah, how do you put that together? Like, maybe this time is different. We have a lot more knowledge, but do you think we are going to succeed in actually having it make a difference?
Yeah, I think that's $1 million question, $1 billion question, about bridging research and practice, right? So we've had these big investments. We're living through a very difficult time. I really think the next frontier of what we have to think about as a society is we actually know a lot of things. Like, universities are great at doing research building, but we are terrible at diffusing that knowledge. We are terrible at explaining it well. And I think given the times in which we live, it's very challenging, but it's also really making us think at the university. Our goal is not, as we say at Harvard, veritas for the sake of veritas, which means truth in Latin. We pursue truth because we think truth is the foundation for good policies, good practices. That's what's going to help society improve. So I think, Emily, part of what I hear you saying is if the research funding goes down, we have to say, well, what do we know that people don't know about? And how can we share that good news widely? And so that's part of what I was doing here. And in writing a book, that's what I want to try to do over the next couple of years. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe there's a silver lining to some of the things that are happening in terms of cuts to research, which is maybe the focus is going to have to be, well, let's make sure people really know about what we've already figured out. Yeah. But that's still kind of scary that there might be kind of a stall in the production of new knowledge, which continues to be important because we have new challenges. So I have to ask, what is it like to work at Harvard these days? And Is your work being affected by by the federal cuts to research?
Yeah, so this is all being recorded, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Well, you already know I'm a very bipartisan guy because when I was in kindergarten, I was as red and as angry as that elephant and as blue and sad as that donkey when kids were making fun of my name.
Oh.
But what I'll say, Emily, is that what society depends on the university to do is take a long-term view of problems and solutions. And what I would say about this momentous time that we're living through is we cannot forget our transcendent mission, that the university was created to take this very long-term view. So I said earlier, we have to avoid quick fix solutions. But we also have to say, look, if the funding goes down or funding goes up, what are those grand challenges, Emily? What are those challenges that are persistent, pervasive, and provocative that we know we're going to still have to work on 10 years from now, even if we had the most money that we've ever had for R&D? So if we can, as a scholarly community, do fewer things better, and say, look, we need everyone to focus on reading comprehension. That's like the thing we need a center on teaching reading comprehension at Harvard, and that's what we got to focus on. I think that's one of the things that's going back to Mr. Rogers, right? Keeping things deep and simple and making sure that the work we do serves society. It's something that I think has changed a lot this spring is if you go to the Harvard University website, all the different ways that the research that we do at the university serves society, from leading to prevention of certain cancers, to improving reading, to all kinds of other things that we need to build a better world.
And you mean that literally the website itself has changed to make those things very clear?
Yes, you should go to our website. It'll celebrate all of the great research activities, and literacy is listed as one of those. And I think that that's a good way to think about our role in society, that we're part of this broader ecosystem, and that we have the luxury as professors of thinking about things for a long time. You know, I thought about this for 10 years. I think about my research in 10-year blocks of time, Emily. Yeah.
Okay, so what's the next 10 years?
What's the next 10 years? Well, that's an easy one. AI, right? Really thinking about the implications for teaching and learning given AI. So one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is I watched Julie's excellent talk, and she had this phrase
This is Julie Washington,
Julie
who
Washington
was here previously, and you can watch it online.
Yep, and Julie said, you know, if you want kids to become better reading comprehenders, you got to get them to talk. And one of the things that we know that teachers really struggle with is what we call dialogic forms of talk. Sometimes talk can be very authoritative. Sometimes it's dialogic. When I talk to my children, I have to impose consequences. Very authoritative. But you want talk to be dialogic. Why did Julie say that? Why is talk so important in reading comprehension? Because reading comprehension is a lot about resolving semantic ambiguities. Right? Remember when I said the small and large? The chicken is ready to eat. What's the picture you have? Do you have chickens like that? Or the chicken is ready to eat? Yeah? Well, when the teacher talks to kids, teacher asks questions. It turns out, though, that the quality of discourse in classrooms could be better. And what AI systems can do is they can use that discourse and give teachers feedback on, oh, you know, you might want to ask this additional how question to get 3 more kids, extending their discussion of this suitcase word system. I think that's what we're going to be focusing on a lot over the next 5 to 10 years.
I just love your optimism. That is awesome. All right, we are going to take questions from the audience. But so let's get our first question ready, and I want to ask you a little question, but maybe not so little. But one of the things that I noted in reading some of your research about what you just described to us is that one of the things you do in that MORE curriculum is kids do not read on screens. They read real print and real books. How come? So
it's actually a little bit of hybrid in that we had to do those assessments. Because of COVID, we did it.
So right. So sometimes you have to teach kids something about screens because that's how they take the test.
Exactly, all those assessments. But what Emily's referring to is like, you know, I showed you a lot of these books and so forth. So when we look at what we know right now about whether the medium matters, the medium matters a lot for young children. So I tell teachers all the time, to the extent that you can, when children are young, try to use print. As much as possible, try to use print. Don't use digital. And part of the reason is, can I share one of my favorite scenes from Charlotte's Web and then connect it to the question you asked me for Sold a Story? So, do you remember in Charlotte's Web when Charlotte is pulling an all-nighter and spinning,
Totally.
spinning a terrific? What does she do? She says to the farm animals, let's see how you spell it. And she explains how you write the T and the E. And what she's doing is something that's very important in early literacy, which is you want to make kids have eye contact with print. You do not want them to be looking around at eye contact in print. And Emily asked me this question about Keith Rayner's research. He's a giant in the field. He did eye tracking studies. And when you read, it feels like you're gliding over text. Actually, like good readers, they process all the text. And that's a lot easier to do when it's print than when it's digital and you can screen. And you turn into a forager. All of you, when you read when you read the Washington Post on your phone, I bet you $1 million if we did eye tracking, you're like all over the place. You don't want that with young children. You want to make sure they have a lot of eye contact with print, the way Charlotte does with the farm animals. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and Templeton goes off and finds her scraps, too, that comes back with the words. I just reread that with these kids that I'm tutoring in third grade. One of the things about Charlotte's Web, man, the vocabulary and the knowledge in that book, there's a lot. There's a lot they need to know. It was a real trip to go through it with some third graders and realize, whoa, there is a lot we got to talk about here.
Yeah, do you remember those graphs I was showing you?
Yeah.
Those hard words that show up.
Fascinating. Okay, so who has a question?
Hey, Barbara Davidson with the Knowledge Matters campaign.
Hey, Barbara.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Fabulous talk. So I'm curious, Jimmy, as you know, the Knowledge Matters campaign elevates these spiraling, knowledge-rich curricula. And we've often had the question over the years about, which ones really are hitting the content that's the most important, and some do it with a little bit more elegant or purposeful sequencing over many a year than others do. And so I'm intrigued by this idea of the web of wise words, and whether or not you would say, and why or why not, there are some webs that have greater impact or are more needed, consulted. Are there power wise webs or not?
I think that's a great question, and I think part of my answer to your question, Barbara, is when we think about spiral curriculum, or what Bruner said about, you can teach anything to any child at any stage of development, right? Where I like to start is at the university. It's with the academic disciplines. And so let me give you an example. Most schools don't teach little kids economics, which is kind of a shame because economics has a lot of really important ideas about, if you think what is the building block of economics, it's just choices. So what we do is we start with actually intro econ textbooks. There's a really nice one. I'm forgetting about the authors, but what they do is they basically set up that schema, Barbara, and they say, what you want freshmen to know about economics is that there are buyers, there are sellers, and there are market systems. And so that's what we do at Moore. We say, in first grade, kids are going to learn about what it means to be a buyer. Then they're going to learn about what it means to be a seller. And then they're going to learn about what it means to be in a market system. And then we do the same things that we did here. And so I think there's a little bit of art and science, Barbara. I think it's the art is thinking, if we want kids to be college and career ready, what are we actually asking them to know foundationally in the disciplines that they study in school? So I think we should look at college. I really do. And we should say, what's the most essential idea that you could teach a first, second, third grader about economics? And I think the thing that I worry about, Barbara, in terms of spiral curriculum and what we're doing is it's too much breadth. It's a mile wide, inch deep. Nobody learns like that, right? You know George Miller's famous paper, The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2. You know why phone numbers are 7 digits? We have constraints on our working memory. So we have to build these schemas, and we have to come back to them in greater depth and complexity. And I think we have to do fewer things well. Now, Barbara, I think the thing that we face, though, is politics. The fact that every state has its own standards. And so what I tell teachers and superintendents is, well, let's start with national standards. Let's start with NGSS. Let's start with C3. Let's start with those standards that apply to everyone. So there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of art. And then there's science. But to me, it comes down to those words, those suitcase words that kids are going to see across their textbooks. And the reality is, I don't know if you've heard of Zipf's law. This is a very famous idea. You need to know 20% of the words to read about 80% of the text. It's because like Zipf's laws, it goes like this in terms of frequency and the word. The, very high frequent. System, you don't see it much. Turns out that whether you're Mike Graves in his first 4,000 words, which are the 4,000 words that comprise, I think, 80% of text through fourth grade, you don't need to build a dictionary. Don't build a dictionary in kids' head. That is not what you want to do. You want to think about those foundational ideas, the disciplines, the words that show up. I don't know, that's my best shot at it. But apart from looking at specific things, I think those are the general principles I would emphasize.
Great. Another question? We have one up here.
Thank you very much. I'm curious. In my elementary school, we were taken to the school library weekly, and we were encouraged to take out any book we wanted, whether it had to do with what we were studying. It didn't matter. Are elementary school teachers still doing that?
So you're asking me if elementary school teachers are still doing the practice of taking kids to the library and letting them pick whatever they want? I guess we call that DEAR, drop everything and read, or SQUIRT, super quiet, uninterrupted reading time.
I haven't heard of SQUIRT.
and let me connect it back to some history. So in the National Reading Panel report, there was a chapter on fluency interventions, and there was this big controversy. Because what it found is that guided oral reading fluency, when you had teachers like read aloud with text kids and they would repeat the reading to be fluent, those seem to help with fluency and there's some transfer to comprehension. But the other type of intervention they looked at were the go choose whatever you want to read. And it turns out those had very mixed findings. Now some people said it's because the best studies were not experiments, they were like correlational and so forth. My sense is that it depends on the school, but it is still widely done. I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I would just say one thing, which is drop everything and read does not have to be sustained in silence. You actually want to stop the kids and ask them what they're reading about. And the reason is simple. When you ask a simple reader like Jimmy, and Jimmy, how do you know you read this book? Jimmy will say things like, well, I read the last word. If you read Josh, Josh, how do you know you read this book? He'll say, I learned about paleontology. Poor readers have very low coherence standards. They'll just read. I'm not understanding. I read the last word. And so we wouldn't want to do that practice, with a large part of our school day because it's not effective in that sense. And what we'd want to do instead is we'd actually want teachers to kind of engage kids and say, well, tell me what you learned. What did you understand? Oh, how is something you read there like something else you've experienced? Transfer, analogical mapping. So I am not completely opposed to it, but in its current form, I think there's room for improvement. And I would hope that schools that use it would remember that it's important for teachers to ask kids about what they're learning, to have that discussion. If you think about book clubs that adults have, is the best part when you're reading alone? I mean, maybe. The best part is probably when you get together as a book club and you talk about it. Yeah. Why don't we do that with young children? We probably should.
Another question?
Good morning, and Dr. Kim, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Donna Lewis Johnson, and I teach 9th grade English at a public charter school here in DC. I'm relatively new to the profession of teaching. Mm-hmm. I transferred from a different career, and I'm finding it the most gratifying experience of my professional life.
Yay.
My question, I want to follow up on the quality of discourse and discussion. And what are some general questions, or what's the framing of some questions that I, as a teacher, could ask students to facilitate a conversation that gets to the contextual meaning of words, gets to the deeper meaning of the text that we just read and stimulates curiosity.
What do you teach, Donna?
I teach English language arts, and we use the College Board curriculum, pre-AP English 1.
Okay. I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I think what we learned from Reading for Understanding is that, I didn't say this, Emily, but when I went into Reading for Understanding, I said, oh, I know we're going to have good results in K-3. Actually, where we had the best results was in the middle school. And I worked on a middle school project. And what the middle school projects had that the K-3 projects did not have is a lot of debate and discussion. And one thing that I would say is, I'll share a story to kind of answer your question. I started my career teaching middle school history in 7th grade across the river at Luther Jackson Middle School. My school was built right after Brown versus Board of Education to prove, for Virginia wanted to prove that it had separate but equal schools. So black students were going to school in Manassas and DC, and they said, oh, we're going to build this school in Fairfax for the black students. And Luther Jackson was a black historian of Reconstruction. And when I started teaching there, I was responsible for U.S. history from Reconstruction to the present. I opened the textbook, and the sentence says something like this. It goes, Reconstruction surfaces timeless questions about the nature of federal-state relationships, the executive powers of the presidency, so forth and so on. Well, you know, why is that so hard for kids? It's because of the word Reconstruction. You see, Reconstruction is a very hard word. Right? What does Reconstruction mean? Well, it means rebuilding your society after the war. If you tear your arm ligament as a picture, and you do Tommy John reconstruction surgery, it means something different. So what I remember thinking, Donna, is like, they really need to know what the Reconstruction idea is, because, do you know why? Because they're going to read another passage when we get to the spring, where Dwight Eisenhower was wondering about the nature of federal-state relationships and civil rights when he had to send federal troops to protect the Little Rock Nine. And so my response to you is, what are those important suitcase words that you know are not just going to be important right now, but next week? And then what are the questions I could ask my kids so I can teach by analogy, right? So most of you are not experts in cell biology, but do you know cells are like kitchens, right? There's like a chef, right? So anytime you can teach something where you get kids to say, how is this like this other thing? How is the human body system like a skyscraper? What kids are doing is they're doing deep thinking. Because struggling readers are not struggling thinkers. And the on-ramp to better literacy is language. Julie talked about that. It's a big find from RFU. One other thing I'll say to you, Donna, about the importance of your question is, you know when I was showing you the reading rope that everyone sees? Part of the reason why the blue word recognition stuff is easier to do is because, as I often tell superintendents, Emily, those skills are fixed, finite, and fixable. How many letters are there? How many vocabulary, background, there's no ceiling to that. There's no sequencing. That's why I pitched the spiral idea. But what does build the vocabulary and background knowledge is when teachers create a discourse community where kids, even if they're struggling readers, can share their smart thinking. And what we learned in our program is a lot of teachers say, man, this is hard stuff. This is really hard. This doesn't feel developmentally appropriate. And I say to them, well, don't underestimate your kids. Have a discussion about how skyscrapers are like the human body. Because if you hear your kids sounding smart, then you're going to change your mind and realize they actually are smart. Even if they can't necessarily decode system on the first time. Because the more you do that, the more they're going to know the word. The more they're going to see how it's pronounced. They're going to sound it and hear how it's sounded out. But you really want them to see its spelling, then its morphology, and then the other words that show up with it. I know, that's what I would say. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. There's a question in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. One of the concepts that I found most compelling about your presentation was the relationship between reading comprehension / language proficiency and motivation. My name is June, and I am a sociolinguist with a little bit of interest in applied linguistics and language acquisition. So I was wondering, understanding that much of the data and notions presented today were to do with early education in English-speaking classrooms, I was wondering if you could speak to some of these concepts as they may apply to multilingual learners who are perhaps learning English as a second language and whose teachers are seeking to improve their second language reading comprehension and general proficiency.
It's a great question. One of the things that we've done in our line of work, and the main reason I shared our website is we believe in open science in our lab, which means that all of our data is publicly available. Anyone can download it, and all of our papers are available. And we have a study that looks specifically at whether the ways that multilingual learners benefit from more are similar or different from the way that kids whose primary language is English benefit. And one of the things that we found that's phenomenally important, it's going to take a little bit of getting your head around this, but I'm going to try to say this slowly. Do you know the suitcase words that I showed you in third grade and second grade, the words like system, structure, function? You know, those are pretty hard words. Well, what we found is that multilingual learners who are in more, at the end of the study, perform at the same level in terms of their vocabulary network, perform at the same level as all the kids in the control group and the group that doesn't get it. What that means is that the kids are basically catching up. And I'm gonna use a phrase to try to explain this. Emily might be talking about this, but in literacy, we have this phrase called Matthew effects. And the idea of Matthew effects is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It's based on this phrase in the Gospel of Matthew. Keith Stanovich wrote a famous paper about this. Because like if Emily has like 10 vocabulary points and I have 5 and it grows exponentially, we're gonna like have a fancy. Well, there's this other idea, which is the planet word idea that I call John effects, right? And that's in the New Testament where it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. We need to think less about Matthew effects and that, you know, some kids have a lot, some kids don't, and what's going on. And we need to think about if we make classrooms much more engaging, where teachers make language and words come to life, because we are embodied creatures, it turns out it actually benefits the kids who need it the most. And so part of what I think is happening, at least from a very instructional perspective, is that we're just not doing that in the business as usual control group. Because the only reason we're doing better is because there's this bigger contrast from what kids typically get to what we get. So this is why I say the reading comprehension crisis is worse than you think, Emily, but schools can do something about it. And that will be my message to you. Now, all the more theoretical parts about the different mechanisms that are in play, take a look at our book, our paper. It was led by my amazing colleague, Jackie Aurelia, who's a professor at NC State. We just won the Fidelson Award from the International Literacy Association for work on English learners. And I'd encourage you to look at that because that gets more into the technical details about, is it language, is it code, what is it that's driving the benefits for multilingual learners? I like this, the way that I would say is, a rising tide lifts all boats. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This was fantastic. So please give them a round of applause. Thank you all for coming this morning. We have another one of these events coming up in September, so check out the website and come back. Enjoy your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you one more time for Dr. Jimmy Kim and Emily Hanford.